Good morning, everyone. Welcome to AEI's webinar, The Disinformation Pandemic. We're going to talk today about Russian and Chinese efforts to shape the information environment in the US and the world, and the ways in which the Chinese and Russian approaches to disinformation appear to be converging in the midst of this crisis. I'm Fred Kagan. I'm the director of the Critical Threats Project here at the American Enterprise Institute. And with me today to discuss this are Dan Blumenthal, the director of Asian Studies in the Foreign and Defense Policy Department at AEI, Zach Cooper, resident fellow research fellow at AEI in China Studies, and Natalia Bugayova, who is the Russia team lead at the Institute for the Study of War. We're looking forward to an interesting discussion today. Each of the participants will make a brief opening series of remarks, and then we'll look forward to taking your questions. Questions can be submitted to Jacqueline.Dirks, JACQUELINE.DERKS at aei.org, or on Twitter with hashtag InfoOpsWebinar. Please provide your name and affiliation when you send your question. I want to flag up front before we begin one of the interesting characteristics of the information operations and the information environment that we're seeing today. As the Russians and the Chinese are working very aggressively to shape the way Americans and Europeans and others in the world understand what is going on and how to think about it, they are simultaneously imposing restrictions on the information available to their own citizens of unprecedented proportions. So they have created an enormous asymmetry between the information spaces in the areas that they control and the information space in the area in which we live. And it's important as we think about how they are engaging in these disinformation operations to understand that asymmetry and the way that it gives them opportunities, but may potentially also create vulnerabilities and problems for them that they're going to have to deal with. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dan to start talking to us about China.
Thank you very much, Fred. And thank you very much to the AEI organizers and to everyone who's participating and watching on YouTube. So, Fred, because my colleague Zach has been really following the difference, how China changed its disinformation and propaganda strategy and how it's converging more with the Russian approach, I thought what I might do in just a few minutes is talk about what didn't change, China's normal approach, and how it actually has played out in COVID-19. So one thing I think that many people missed, as you alluded to, is how much of China's propaganda and disinformation efforts begin at home and is targeted to the Chinese people themselves. Because China is so enmeshed in world affairs, that by itself has an effect of propagating misinformation abroad. So here's what I mean. Let's just take COVID-19, for example. So at the beginning of the crisis, there wasn't anything particularly new about the way the Chinese approached information. As the crisis unfolded in December, when Wuhan officials clearly already knew there was a real problem on their hands, as did central CCP authorities, they began to censor relevant information about the disease and to punish people seeking to tell the truth about the information. So that's the famous cases of Dr. I and Dr. Li. But it wasn't just that those two were punished when they decided to report on WeChat groups, on social media groups, that there was a new novel SARS very infectious disease on their hands. the notification from the Public Security Bureau in Wuhan was to everyone on the internet that if you discuss and deviate from the party line on anything having to do with the virus in Wuhan, you will be detained and punished, and many, many people are. So disinformation starts at home. Because of that, the United States and the rest of the world was not getting good information about the virus, it costing everyone a lot of time and eventually lives because of the CCP censors went into overdrive and continue to be in overdrive today. So the story in the West, although a bit muddled, is that the Chinese were slow to react, but since then did the quote perfect lockdown and have the virus behind them and so forth. Nothing could be further than the truth. When reporters went down, independent reporters and other very brave people in China went down into Wuhan during the lockdown, what they saw was a complete and total humanitarian disaster. The censors went back into overdrive at that point. Okay. Not only did the censors go into overdrive at that point, and by the way, this is all normal behavior of the CCP because the CCP relies upon censorship and avoiding embarrassment and a party line that everything is fine and they're fighting the disaster. And of course, that it's always, quote, foreign hostile forces that are responsible for the Chinese people suffering. All of this is just lit up now in Chinese internal propaganda and in Chinese censorship activities. But of course, they also started to destroy scientific information as well. And the central authorities in China now control anything that is put up by scientists that would have anything to do with a cure or trace of the origins of the disease. Okay, so why does that matter to us? This is normal Chinese behavior. The problem with normal Chinese behavior is China's not North Korea. It's not isolated. It's enmeshed in the international system. So when China's political pathologies are now exported abroad. So even if China never engaged in the massive disinformation campaign aimed at us externally that Zach will talk about, we would still have basically a whole set of misinformation, disinformation that we would just naturally and inadvertently repeat in our newspapers about the coronavirus. Okay, so so that's just my point in all that. Obviously, is China's internal censorship, its crushing of information, its disappearances, its normal modes of behavior during any crisis or even not during a crisis has a huge effect on the rest of the world nowadays. It just what goes on in China cannot stay in China. Next, I would just say, okay, what else is normal Chinese activities? So normal Chinese activities in the external propaganda world has usually been very different from the Russians in the sense that A, they have a lot more money, they've bought up a lot more media companies throughout the world and set up their own Chinese language or Arabic language or African, different African languages to propagate a positive Chinese line, which is China is going to be the global leader in the world. It is going to do so in a way that's much more gentle and harmonious than the United States has been. It'll be a much more benign hegemon. Everyone has to sign up to new language the Chinese are using. We all have to sign up to a community of common destiny in Chinese terms, which is different than the US built world order. That's normal, everyday Chinese influence campaigns, positive themes about what the CCP is up to. You can pick up a People's Daily filler inside a US newspaper and see those themes about how well China is doing, how it's a different sort of dominant player. This is all to push China's agenda of becoming a global leader, of displacing the United States, positively themed. You'll see lots of terms like harmonious, lots of themes like more fair, non-aggressive, and so on. that is normal and then the other thing the Chinese do in terms of propagating that theme that they are a friendlier hegemon, they'll be a friendlier dominant player, a more effective one. We all know, we've all heard about the Beijing model, of course, which is the Chinese propagate through their different propaganda organs externally, which is supposed to be more efficient than democracies, supposed to be more benign, faster growth, and so on. Let me just end by saying, so this is obviously disinformation. It's just not true. The Beijing model doesn't work in China, as we've just seen with the COVID-19 virus. It's actually caused more suffering. So, but this is the normal way China does business in terms of propaganda and disinformation. I would say, just to sum up, that the key way that China has in the past propagated disinformation is by blocking good information. So let me just end by pointing to one more sort of normal course of business for China, and that is using their market power to block themes they don't like. So you could say, okay, well, what does the National Basketball Association, for example, have to do with disinformation? Well, if all of a sudden China is threatening a major US cultural icon with not getting market access, this is all before COVID, then all of a sudden there are all kinds of incentives inside the United States to propagate China about Hong Kong, about all sorts of other issues. You get willing participants because the Chinese are willing to throw their market power. Also very different than the Russians. So let me end there. We can go, I hope we get into question and answers. There's a lot more to this, but I again would say the biggest cause up to this point of Chinese disinformation, misinformation, is what they block and distort at home. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. I think it's an incredibly important point that's worth bringing home because China relates to China more than to other countries because it's so large and so powerful. But the notion that disinformation begins at home and that disinformation that originates in one country targeted at its own people, including control of information aimed at its own people, doesn't stay there. In our global information space, when one country begins manipulating its own information environment, it tends to have effects on the global information environment and on us. So frequently unintentional effects, I think, although in China's case, probably also intentional. So it's a really, really important point to bring home. Thank you, Dan. Zach, talk to us about what's new.
Well, thank you so much, Fred. It's great to get a chance to talk about this subject. And I just want to build on the fantastic comments that Dan made and maybe lead into a little bit of what Natalia is going to talk about. So as Dan said, traditionally what we've seen from Beijing is positive messages about China. That has typically been the key element in their propaganda campaign. So if you pick up a China Daily insert, it says lots of good things about how great the Communist Party leadership has been and how fantastic Chinese growth has been. It has not tended to drag down other countries or other systems the way the Russians have. And what we're seeing now is a pretty rapid change in that. We have two cases at least. The first is going back last fall to Hong Kong, just as Dan was talking about. We started seeing a different narrative, and the first time that the Chinese have actually shifted towards using social media to go after, in a negative way, a target within the United States. So there was an orchestrated social media campaign that went after Hong Kong supporters within the United States. And that has now been followed up with another campaign, obviously, in the last few months to spread disinformation around the pandemic. And what we've seen is a couple of propagation efforts, not led by some random part of the party or some random group in China, but in fact led directly by China's foreign ministry, and in fact by the spokespeople for China's foreign ministry. And this is a real change. This has been pushed out now by multiple embassies worldwide. I think at last count, it was something like 15 or 17 ambassadors that have tweeted out these fake lines about where the virus came from. Some of those lines have attributed it to a US Army athletic team that went to Wuhan and said that it was intentionally them that brought the virus to Wuhan. Others have suggested that in fact the virus was spreading back in the fall, either in the United States or Italy. But this is an effort to just tear down truth in the West. And this is not something we have typically seen from China, specifically not directed against the United States. And so this is absolutely a major change in my view. And I think it reflects the deep concern that leaders in Beijing have about their inability to control the early days of the coronavirus. And as Dan was saying, you go back and look at what happened in December and January, it was clearly mishandled, and it undermines the Communist Party's core logic for remaining in power. The fact that they argue that they can bring political stability and economic growth, and now we're seeing the economic down as a result of the pandemic, not just in China, increasingly under some level of pressure. Sorry, I think you lost me there for a second. Just the last few days, we've seen stories suggesting that the United States has been under some pressure from abroad, right, to speak differently about how it talks about COVID, that the Europeans had an assessment of disinformation that the Chinese weighed in on and tried to block. And so this has been a sort of global campaign. And in the last just 48 hours, the Australian government has come under substantial pressure from Beijing to try and back off from launching an international investigation of where the virus came from and how it's been propagated. So this is an effort launched by the foreign ministry against governments in democratic countries all over the world. And this is just a major change, and as I said, and I think to lead into what Natalia is going to talk about, it resembles something much more like what we've seen traditionally from the Russians, which is efforts to sort of create questions about whether truth really exists. You know, it's impossible to know where the virus came from. This is not the old stodgy Chinese propaganda that we're used to. In fact, now Xinhua has been putting out a 1.5-minute long video, which is sort of like a cartoon. It's catchy, it's exciting. It's very different than what we typically see from the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda organs as they operate in the West. So why don't I leave it there and really look forward to the discussion after we hear from Natalia.
Thanks, Zach. I appreciate that. Let's talk about the Russian perspective as it relates to this, and Natalia also some of the specific interesting examples of what you've seen the Russians doing to manipulate this crisis.
Thank you, Fred. I will start by saying that Russia's information efforts around COVID have not been merely opportunistic. In fact, they've been supporting a number of longstanding objectives, and actually across multiple theaters. What we're watching are primarily about three main categories or directions of the Kremlin's information efforts around COVID. The first bucket is directed at the US and the West. Already in mid-January, the US State Department reported that Russian bot networks and proxy media have been spreading conspiracies that it's the US that's behind COVID. Russian media has been also amplifying narratives about racism that's emerging in the West around COVID. More recently, however, we're seeing the Kremlin trying to frame the US and the West generally as inhumane for keeping the sanctions during pandemic in various countries. Now, this is a part of a much larger effort that Putin launched early March to lift sanctions using the excuse of COVID, not just on Russia, but also on its partners, Iran, Syria, etc. Now, it's important to know that it's actually not all criticism and not all anti-Western narrative. In fact, we see Putin increasingly reaching out to the West. Russian Ministry of Defense delivered aid to the US, Italy, several Balkan countries, despite facing shortages at home. Putin is also trying to engage members of the United Nations Security Council. NATO, in fact, actually reported early April that some of Russian disinformation around COVID has gone down. Now, in my assessment, it's happening for a couple of reasons. One of them is because pressures of COVID and oil are actually starting to reveal some of Putin's weaknesses. So he's trying to play the humanitarian actor and good Samaritan, as he actually cannot afford any additional sanctions right now, and trying to get rid of the new one, the existing ones. What I will mention is that the fact that Putin is reaching out and overt disinformation might have gone down doesn't mean it's less of a problem for the West. In fact, it means that the information shifted and transformed to support high-level objectives such as sanctions removal. I will also add that anti-Western disinformation still persists, but Russia is now targeting different theaters with it. For example, that's a fascinating narrative that Russian networks are promoting in Ukraine, that it's actually CIA-run biological laboratories that have invented COVID. So it's the same narrative, but it's used in different theater for different purpose. In this case, creating negative sentiment against the United States within Ukraine, which brings me to the second bucket of Russia's disinformation around COVID, which is focused on Russia's primary campaigns, such as Ukraine. In March, we assessed at the ISW that Kremlin actors launched a very sophisticated and highly coordinated campaign in Ukraine that my colleague George Barris wrote a great piece on. The campaign was aimed to fuel protests against Ukrainian evacuees coming back from China. Now, the reason it really matters for the US and most important thing about that campaign was that it actually generated kinetic effects, meaning fighting in physical world. So how do Russians do that? We've seen in a matter of just few days, a set of viral texts sent to people all across Ukraine with fake information saying that COVID-infected evacuees are coming to their towns and openly calling for protests. The email accounts of Ukrainian health ministry were hacked and thousands of emails gone out, also with fake information to fuel fear. And as a result, there was a protest, in fact, and it created huge crisis management requirement and damage control requirements for the Ukrainian government. Now, these scare and fear-based campaigns, Russia has been using them for ages in Ukraine. What's interesting, I think, is that Russia might be using COVID to also test health-related fear-based campaigns as it continues to evolve its hybrid warfare toolkit, and can use these approaches elsewhere. So it's really important to watch that. Final bucket, actually, it's similar to what Dan and Zach have been talking about in China, that disinformation for Russia also starts at home. The third effort is actually domestic information control. Putin is facing a number of pressures domestically as both COVID and oil price pressures are converging. And his primary objective is to keep control of the narrative. So we've seen Russia suppressing the information domestically, both about COVID rates likely, silencing doctors, empowering the main censorship agency to crack down at will. They even felt the need to suppress information coming out of Russia-occupied territories in DNR, LNR in Ukraine about true COVID rates, to the point where they blocked Ukrainian websites that were sharing the information about the situation in those regions. Interestingly, Putin is also now faced with the challenge of suppressing some of the online protests. Now, we assess that at this point, he has a very strong control over domestic information space and is in no immediate danger of losing it. However, if situation protracts, the requirement for him to maintain that control will become increasingly costly. So these are just some of the key directions of the information efforts that we're observing, and I would be happy to elaborate on any of them and take additional questions.
Thank you, Natalia. So we have a number of questions, and I'll start with one that leads into something we promised in the advertisement for this presentation, which is a discussion about what people can do about all of this. Corey Shockey, AEI's Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy, says one particularly pernicious factor in China's disinformation is the willingness of media in free societies to accept their claims without the kind of investigatory scrutiny they give US sources. Can you suggest ways to redress this? So I'm going to start by making an observation about two factors that I think are really facilitating the effectiveness of Russian and Chinese and Iranian and other disinformation campaigns within the US. One of them is a fundamental characteristic of the information space that I've observed, and I'm sure many others have as well. I call it the asymmetry of outrage and retraction. And what I mean by that is that when someone makes an outrageous claim, an outrageous assertion, the virus came from an army lab and was planted in China, that outrageous accusation frequently gets a lot of play to begin with. And then as the truth emerges, as corrections come out, responsible media outlets start to print corrections or retractions or various other things. But the corrections and retractions rarely get anything like the attention that the original outrageous claim got. And so as soon as the claim is made, the damage is frequently done. And the ability of free societies to chase after outrageous claims is just inherently limited. And I think that's a permanent factor of the information space that we're living in. But I think there's a particular factor that is unusual in the time that we're living in, which is that mutual mistrust among Americans and hostility between Americans is so high that people are much more inclined to accept and believe outrageous accusations levied against America because they will assign that America to a group of Americans that they distrust or don't like, and therefore have it feed into a narrative of mistrust and hostility that's pre-existing. So the rift within our society and the mistrust within our society and the hostility within our society is a factor that our adversaries are absolutely able to play on. So what can we do about that? Well, we can rebuild trust in our society and try to reduce the hostility between Americans, which is a noble aim that I think we really actually do need to work on, but I don't expect to achieve that aim anytime soon. Nor do I think we're going to be able to do anything about the asymmetry of outrage and retraction. But I do think that we can increase our efforts to investigate and study and expose deliberate disinformation campaigns, as my colleagues have been doing. So let me open the floor to them if they'd like to make any other comments about this question or talk specifically about what they think we can do to get after this problem.
Zach, did you want to go first? I have a couple thoughts.
Sure, maybe I'll just make a couple of comments. I think Fred hit it exactly right, that what the Russians have typically done, right, is use existing divisions within foreign societies as points for leverage for these false narratives, right? And they've accentuated these divisions. They've made it more difficult for democracies to operate as a result. And so I think fixing some of those divides is the long-term answer. It's not going to happen quickly, and it won't happen entirely. But I think the degree to which we have points of pressure that are easy to push on, that increases our vulnerability. I would also say, I think we're heading towards a world where we're going to have to make some hard choices about the level of disinformation that we tolerate in our society from foreign state actors, right? Why is it that China is allowed to ban Twitter and Facebook in China, and yet its foreign ministry is allowed to spread propaganda and flat out disinformation within the United States, right? I think people are going to start asking hard questions about that. Why is it that the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post just got kicked out of China and they can't report there, and yet I can read a China Daily insert in those newspapers much of the time when you pick them up on the street? So I think overall, our answer, and unfortunately the best answer for democracies, is just openness and transparency is how we succeed. We don't want to have to close down. But I think to the extent that Beijing and Moscow are unwilling to allow us to have reporters that operate freely in their countries and have our messages penetrate into their systems, we're going to have to think hard about whether we want to allow flat out disinformation on our networks. I think that's a really tough debate for a lot of reasons, a lot of civil liberty questions and free speech questions. But I definitely think at the end of the day, when the Chinese Foreign Ministry is pushing a narrative that suggests that the virus came from the United States, which is absolutely untrue, we've got to start asking some hard questions about whether we're going to allow them to continue to do so.
I might just add to those excellent comments at 2 points. So one is the US has not been really in the great power strategic information operations game for a very long time, and has lost its muscles with respect to a country as powerful as China. There are it's a different time, obviously, a much more divisive time, as Fred and Zach pointed to, but there are some very good case studies of how we handled this sort of thing with the Soviets, for example. When the Soviets began to spread disinformation that the US CIA started the AIDS crisis. There was something at a very, very high level of the US government, Secretary of State, CIA director, which is now gone, and there's called the Measures Working Group, successfully chasing down the sources, working with foreign newspapers as well, to trace it back to Soviet propaganda organs. I'm obviously not getting the story fully right. The point is that we absolutely need a new function of the U.S. government at a very high level, simply dedicated to that sort of thing. That, and this gets into my point too, and we don't have it. We just don't have it. I mean, there are some attempts with the Global Engagement Center and so forth, but we don't have that sustained level of high level engagement on the information space and disinformation. The second point would be, okay, well, in order to do that, you need some cooperation from the US media, particularly the most respected outlets. And I would say, I mean, this isn't a session on complaining about the US media, but I would say even when I read articles about US responses in the New York Times or other places, sometimes the investigations are very good, particularly when they're foreign-based who can actually access information on China. But the level of sort of unnamed sourcing or no sourcing and just telling the wrong story about how the US is responding to China has been astonishing, actually. And this has nothing to do with disinformation. This has to do with partisan divides, incentives in the media, and so forth. I think the media, as independent actors, needs to call itself into service to the country and say, look, we are the media and we're not an arm of the government, but we are at this point unwittingly adding fuel to the fire on disinformation by not questioning our sources, by treating Chinese-based sources as the same as US-based sources, by treating Chinese propaganda videos as the same thing as things that the Chinese people actually read. I think a real call to duty by the media is extremely important right now, and say, look, we're going to continue to tell the truth, and we're going to continue to get the truth out of the US government, but we're not going to be unwitting participants in a global disinformation campaign.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Natalia, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts on the Russian disinformation and what to do about that. So essentially, I think there are two thoughts. One, recognizing the level, recognizing the objectives of disinformation, and then recognizing the methods. On the objectives level, first and foremost, it's almost never the goal of Russian disinformation to make people believe in specific lies. In fact, the goal is often to create and cultivate the conspiratorial thinking within the society. Additionally, it's very rarely when Russian disinformation is purely opportunistic and just is aimed at creating chaos or exploiting divisions. It's almost always tied to other objectives, in part because Kremlin has very few resources in its toolkit to advance its objectives, and the information is one of them, as we see right now with Russia's efforts to promote sanctions. And I think at the level of objectives, recognizing them will actually help create collective immunity. And some countries have higher collective immunity to Russian disinformation, in part because media is playing such an important role, but also civil society, government, strategic intelligence, the combination of that can create that immunity. I think on the methods level, fake also has a pattern, and learning how to recognize over time the particular spin, the particular context is actually possible, because it's almost never about precise facts. It's almost always about what context Russian media puts them in, what conclusions and logical links it draws for you when it spins it, that it is possible to build that knowledge base over time, and also collective immunity at the methods level as well.
Thank you, Natalia. I think all of these comments flow nicely also into a question that Peter Bowe asked, or a series of questions. Peter Bowe from Dredgewire. He asked, who are our strongest allies in exposing this problem? More importantly, who is helping the Russians and Chinese the most or turning a blind eye? What tools do we have to counteract, and what policy actions are indicated? I think we've addressed some of those, but I want to follow up on a couple of points that my colleagues have made here. Personally, I'm very leery about the notion of standing up a US government organization for the purpose of counteracting misinformation or deciding what foreign information is allowed to come into the US information space. Largely because I think that especially in the current environment, it's likely to be ineffective because people will take such a jaundiced view of anything now that looks like the US government actually trying to control information. I think there's the exception though, and this I'd like to offer to my colleagues for their thoughts, is along the lines of what Natalia said. The government and or private sector technology firms can harness technologies that are available to trace some of these disinformation campaigns to their sources, and to do that very rapidly. And sometimes you can do that, and we'll see this pop up as a technology company will say, there's a bot farm that is putting out this viral disinformation, and we know that, or we assess that the Russians are behind that, and so forth. But also using the kind of semantic analysis that Natalia is talking about. The words fall into patterns, the way modes of argumentation fall into patterns, and those patterns can be recognized. And I think to the extent that we can have a support from the government and from the private sector, simply to trace the messaging back to the originator, so that at least we can be saying and flagging, look, here with this information, we're not going to stop the American people from seeing it, but we want you to know this came off of Chinese servers. It falls into the pattern of a Chinese information campaign. It appears very much to be Chinese disinformation. So understand that when you take this information in. And I think along those lines, to answer the question, who are our most important allies, I have to go back to Dan's point and say, the media at the end of the day, the professional mainstream media is the most important potential ally. It is also unwittingly, I think, the most important helper of this disinformation at the moment. And I think it is unwitting. In fact, I'm very confident that it is unwitting. And I think a couple of factors are leading to that problem. Dan pointed to some of them. I think the hyperpartisanship that we have going on now is another big part of that, because it has made all foreign policy domestic policy. Every foreign policy issue now is a domestic. Russia is a domestic policy issue in the United States. China is a domestic policy issue. The foreign policy almost doesn't exist as a concept in American political discourse anymore, because it all revolves around what did Trump say about China? And there are people who will say, well, whatever Trump said about China is true, and other people who say whatever Trump said about China is false, and we'll get into an argument about that. The point that I would offer is to say, you can say whatever you want to say about what you think about the accuracy or validity or reasoning or motivation behind anything that Trump says or anything Biden says, or we can have those discussions. But we need to separate those discussions from the question of the truth of the statement itself. Because just because Trump says it and you're inclined to disbelieve anything he says doesn't mean that it isn't true. And I think that, and the converse is also true. And I think that we have to really work, and the media in particular has to work to avoid seeing everything through the prism of this partisan fight that we're having. And I think that that's going on to some extent. And it's been interesting to me to observe, and I'd love for Dan and Zach to talk about this if they'd like, the controversy over whether the virus originated in a lab or not. And the way in which the media has covered that has oscillated, in my observation, but also gone down some paths that are secondary paths, because I feel like that question has gotten confused with the question of whether it was a tailored creation. And that I don't even know to what extent this is deliberate disinformation. Dan, Zach, what do you think about this issue and how it's been covered?
I'm going to use the chance to say I'm a little less jaundiced about the U.S. government's ability to push back against disinformation, and I'll use a case right now. So probably the greatest effect, the greatest impact on having the U.S. media and others look into the Wuhan Institute of Virology and its biosafety practices was a leak of State Department cables from 2018 into a columnist in the Washington Post. That changed the conversation, in my view. And it also got other reporters chasing that story. Of course, it's gotten confused with the question of bioweapons and biodefense and so forth. The government, the U.S. government, didn't stay on top of that story either, but it was a deliberate attempt by the U.S. government to put out information that should be looked at more carefully out there, and it even in all the divisiveness, it's had an impact. All of us are now trying to figure out. We all know about the Wuhan lab. We all know about its closeness to the Wuhan wet market. People are looking, the media is now chasing the story more than it would have otherwise. So I think there is a role to play, as jaundiced as people are about the U.S. government. I think they can continue to play that role. I hope in a more systematic fashion, at least help people chase down leads and turn them onto information that they otherwise wouldn't have. So I think that's important. I think obviously the divisiveness of the media and so forth has caused this back and forth about bioweapons, not bioweapons. Led into conspiracy theories and so forth. But I think generally speaking, a number of independent actors inside U.S. politics, and then a couple of very good investigative reporters have chased the story down to the point where governments, not just in the United States, but others, want answers about the safety at this Wuhan lab. Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me, I'm much more focused, I think, on what I think is sort of the core problem the Communist Party had in December and January with getting this under control. And, I think people should rightfully be angry with how the virus was controlled and how information was let out. And on that issue, I think there's just been some wonderful work done in the media. And in fact, the reporting was so good that the Communist Party decided it couldn't stand it and had to kick American reporters out of China from the Journal and the Post and the Times who'd been doing the reporting. So I'm pretty happy with a lot of the coverage we've seen recently that sort of uncovers a lot of the mishandling of the early days of the virus. And I don't know what happened with the lab and all of that, but I think the one thing we absolutely do know is that the Communist Party mishandled the virus for at least a month, maybe two. And they weren't open. They didn't let others in to actually investigate what was going on. And through mid-January, we were still being told that there was no human-to-human transmission, which was clearly a lie at that point. And if it wasn't a lie, it's even worse because it suggests that the Communist Party for 2 months had human-to-human transmission and couldn't get that under control for some reason and didn't even know about it. So I guess for me, I think the main allies here are the broadcast media, as you've been saying, those folks doing great reporting. And I would just say, I'm a little bit hopeful in this regard, because if you look at the places that Beijing has weighed in the most in the last year or two, in the media space, it's been Hong Kong and Taiwan. And those are the places that Beijing should understand the best. They have large ethnic Chinese populations. They're close to China. And yet, if you actually look at what's happened at the end of the day, both have had elections that have gone strongly against what the Communist Party wanted to happen. And in fact, we've seen some blowback here in the United States as well. There's some debate about this, but the Chinese ambassador, Sui Tiankai, came out and basically opposed the kind of disinformation that his own foreign ministry was spreading here. And so I'm a little bit hopeful that we're going to be able to push back on these kinds of media campaigns. It's not going to stop them. And we know that China will get smarter and more effective in how they use these tools, just like the Russians have. But I do think we've already seen a bit of pushback. And I would just cite two final things, which is the story in the last 48 hours that leaked to Reuters about how concerned the Communist Party is with the blowback within China. And then another set of stories about how worried they are about the blowback outside of China, I think shows that people are still willing, even though there are huge risks in China, to leak this kind of critical information to Western media. And they're playing an absolutely important role about talking about what's going on both inside in China and outside as well.
Thank you, Zach. Natalia, I'll come to you in a moment if you would like to weigh in on this. I want to flag a question, and it's a question in my mind. I don't know what the answer is. When we have states that are expelling American media outlets or Western media outlets because those media outlets are actually reporting the truth, actually trying to report what's going on, and those same states, and this dovetails to a number of questions that have been asked on our feed. But those states continue to purchase access to American media, continue to publish in the American information space with state-owned entities, Sputnik, or Russia Today, and so on. Should we try to block access to those outlets in retaliation for having our reporters denied access to their markets? The concern I have there is, and I will let Natalia start with this if she has a thought, would we risk then advancing an objective of creating a segmented global information environment that would actually facilitate the internal controls of adversaries like Russia and China and Iran and so forth, by creating an environment in which people are expelling reporters and then other people are blocking access and so forth, so that we're just de facto super empowering those who want to control their own information environments? Or is this an appropriate tool that we should discuss?
I could make a comment. I think one of the dangers in the current situation is actually defining down and scoping down the nature of the disinformation just to media and just to actual outlets and social media, etc. In Russia, at least, it's a lot broader than that. The space includes not just the media infrastructure that they've created. it also includes all platforms and conferences and organizations that Russia is using globally to essentially circulate their narratives and push their agendas. So I think by going after particular segments of it, you won't necessarily solve the problem, and you of course might limit your own freedoms. And one of the goals that they actually have is that the US limits its own freedoms at home. So I think it's actually quite dangerous to define information space down. I think it's a conceptual fallacy that would actually lead to wrong policy decisions in the end.
So Fred, I think that it depends how you define the problem. So what we have been doing in the United States is identifying which reporters from China are doing what, and if they are in fact agents of the state, which many of them are, not all of them, but Xinhua reporters and so forth, they should be required at least to register as foreign agents of the state. And I think that's also to Zach's point. It's not exactly reciprocity, but it is the truth. So next time a reporter from CGTN or Xinhua or the People's Daily asks a question or attempts to, quote, investigate a story, unquote, identifying that individual as a registered foreign agent of the Chinese government is very important in terms of the source of information. Willy-nilly kicking reporters out if they're, reporters, and obviously this is, you have to be very careful about this. So, but if they are agents of influence and you can trace them to, if you can trace them to the work of various China propaganda organs, which is not difficult to do. We know the 6 or 7 agencies that are in charge. Then I do think you have to limit their access, or at the very least, make them register as not reporters, but foreign agents, propaganda agents, information agents, whatever you want to call them. And that's just a basic principle, I think, that we need to begin with.
Yeah, just a very quick comment, which is I agree with Natalia that, the core of our system is openness and free speech. And I think that's absolutely critical and we can't get away from that. I also think part of what's important is that people understand where the speech is coming from, if it's from a malicious actor. So, for example, I will often pick up a newspaper and it will have an insert in it that says everything you need to know about China. Well, it would be nice to know that the people who wrote that insert were the Chinese Communist Party, right? Same thing when you go on the internet. There are a surprising number of times on major sites that you go onto those sites and they have a story that has been written by someone in Beijing that is under the headline of a foreign, like an American newspaper or an American periodical, right? And I think we've got to be incredibly careful to make sure that people know where the information is coming from. And I mean, one downside that Beijing has in this regard is it actually, Dan was talking earlier about economic leverage. The companies it doesn't have a lot of economic leverage over are places like Facebook and Twitter, because they're not allowed into China. And I think Facebook and Twitter are going to be asking some really hard questions about what they want to allow on their platforms. And the great thing about that is there's no US government decision to be made there. This is a private decision for Facebook and Twitter and other social media platforms about what kind of speech they want to allow. And I think it's great if private Chinese citizens are allowed to speak, but certainly if there's disinformation being put out by a malign foreign government actor, I think that's something that they are going to have to look at hard.
Fred, can I add one thing really quickly? So it's not just identifying the sources in terms of who are these, quote, reporters in the United States. I picked up a pretty good piece today in a newspaper covering disinformation and other aspects of US-China tension, quoting a lot of what they called Chinese academics as sources for information. it would be even more helpful if there was a greater understanding of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party and the identification of the sources themselves. Like, these are not US or European or Taiwanese academics. If they are tied to a particular think tank, then they are agents of the internal security forces of the Chinese government. They're quoted as if they have equivalency with a US academic speaking completely freely. So still have a lot of work to do in terms of educating people about the nature of the CCP and who is free to speak and who is not.
I think that's a great point, and I think as I consider what are appropriate and most likely to be successful responses to this problem that don't undermine core American values and don't make our own problems worse, I think we combat misinformation with more information. And I think that we combat the efforts of opaque governments to engage in our open society by trying to create transparency in what those governments are doing. And this gets at a number of questions that have also been asked along the lines of, how do we know that these are even state-sponsored? How do we know that these aren't just random noise within the information environment? And the answer, of course, is some of the things, a lot of the things that go on in the information environment are just random noise. But we do know that some of these campaigns actually are state-sponsored and state-controlled, and we know that through various means. We know it sometimes through cyber means. We know what information systems they came off of, and we know who owns those wires, and we know who owns those systems. Sometimes we know who did it, and we know that those people are agents of foreign governments. Sometimes we get email leaks of foreign governments, and we've seen this from the Russians. We've had several leaks from senior Russian officials about what they were doing in Ukraine, in which they talked about the information operations that they were running, and then you could observe those. So we have various degrees of evidence that foreign governments are running information and disinformation campaigns. And that evidence can be made available and is made available. And I think we can do more along those lines. But what occurs to me here is that it's become common and standard for professional media outlet to flag potential conflicts of interest in its stories. And you see this all the time now. The Washington Post, anytime that it's going to write about Amazon, mentions that Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post as a disclaimer, as a full disclosure. And I think that to the extent that the media would extend that effort to making clear just the factual statements that one can make, these sources are officials of the Chinese Communist Party who are working at an academic organization, and leave it at that, and let Americans then judge how they want to take in that information, rather than trying to deny them access to the information, which I think is not the right approach. Flagging, just having the media identify properly and put in the disclaimers, which can also include, by the way, these statements by these sources in Russia or China, track very closely with, including in verbiage, formal statements of the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs that are known to have been involved in this or that or the other information campaign. Just helping Americans understand and contextualize the sources that are being cited and the information and the statements that are being cited, so that they can make their own evaluations, to me seems like the best approach that's most in accord with our values. We have a couple of minutes, and I want to just raise one last question that was brought up about an objective of an information campaign, which is the objective to argue that all sanctions regimes should be suspended because of COVID. And this has been an interesting case where the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians have all been messaging in unison to say, because of the COVID crisis and the damage that they're suffering, sanctions regime should be lifted, and humanitarian exceptions to sanctions are not sufficient. And it's fascinating. We've written about that at CTP, and ISW has written about it. And I think Dan and Zach have discussed this as well. It's something to keep an eye on, because it is another effort to try to use the disinformation around COVID and the information environment to advance important objectives of adversary states. And I flag this attack on sanctions in particular because we Americans need to consider what the consequences to us would be of stripping ourselves of the ability to use our economic leverage as a tool of foreign policy through sanctions. And the risk I see there, the enormous risk I see there, is the risk of stripping ourselves of an important non-lethal tool and putting ourselves into a situation where the only options we have when confronted with aggression or some other misbehavior are either to do nothing and acquiesce to it or engage in some kind of kinetic military operation. And I think that it's important for us to defend the principle of being able to use sanctions in the face of what is a rising information campaign to try to benefit from COVID on the part of our adversary states. This is a very complicated discussion. There are, as you see, no easy solutions. And I think we are going to have to continue to wrestle with this as a society. I'm very grateful to my colleagues for the research that they've done in exposing what our adversaries are doing and how it's playing out, and for their thoughtful comments today. And I thank everyone in the audience for joining us as well. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.